Chapter 11. At the summit of the cone, the interior of the crater. Sea everywhere, no land in sight, a bird's eye view of the coast, hydrography and orography, is the island. Inhabited. A geographical baptism, Lincoln Island. A half-hour later they walked back to the camp. The engineer contented himself with saying to his comrades that the country was an island, and that tomorrow they would consider what to do. Then each disposed himself to sleep, and in this basalt cave, 2,500 feet above sea level, they passed a quiet night in profound repose. The next day, March 30, after a hurried breakfast on roast trajopan, they started out for the summit of the volcano. All desired to see the isle on which perhaps they were to spend their lives, and to ascertain how far it lay from other land, and how near the course of vessels bound for the archipelagos of the Pacific. It was about 7 o'clock in the morning when they left the camp. No one seemed dismayed by the situation. They had faith in themselves, no doubt, but the source of that faith was not the same with Smith as with his companions. They trusted in him, he in his ability to extort from the wilderness around them all the necessaries of life. As for Pencroff, he would not have despaired, since the rekindling of the fire by the engineer's lens, if he had found himself upon a barren rock, if only Smith was with him. "Bah!" said he, "we got out of Richmond without the permission of the authorities, and it will be strange if we can't get away sometime from a place where no one wants to keep us." They followed the route of the day before, flanking the cone till they reached the enormous crevasse. It was a superb day, and the southern side of the mountain was bathed in sunlight. The crater, as the engineer had supposed, was a huge shaft gradually opening to a height of 1,000 feet above the plateau. From the bottom of the crevasse large currents of lava meandered down the flanks of the mountain, indicating the path of the eruptive matter down to the lower valleys which furrowed the north of the island. The interior of the crater, which had an inclination of 35 or 40 degrees, was easily scaled. They saw on the way traces of ancient lava, which had probably gushed from the summit of the cone before the lateral opening had given it a new way of escape. As to the volcano chimney which communicated with the subterranean abyss, its depth could not be estimated by the eye, for it was lost in obscurity, but there seemed no doubt that the volcano was completely extinct. Before 8 o'clock, the party were standing at the summit of the crater, on a conical elevation of the northern side. The sea everywhere, was the universal exclamation. There it lay, an immense sheet of water around them on every side. Perhaps Smith had hoped that daylight would reveal some neighboring coast or island. But nothing appeared to the horizon line, a radius of more than 50 miles. Not a sail was in sight. Around the island stretched a desert infinity of ocean. Silent and motionless, they surveyed every point of the horizon. They strained their eyes to the uttermost limit of the ocean. But even Pencroff, to whom nature had given a pair of telescopes instead of eyes, and who could have detected land even in the faintest haze upon the sea line, could see nothing. Then they looked down upon their island, and the silence was broken by Spilett. "How large do you think this island is?" It seemed small enough in the midst of the infinite ocean. Smith thought a while, noticed the circumference of the island, and allowed for the elevation. "My friends," he said, "if I am not mistaken, the coast of the island is more than 100 miles around. Then its surface will be. That is hard to estimate, the outline is so irregular." If Smith was right, the island would be about the size of Malta or Zante in the Mediterranean, but it was more irregular than they, and at the same time had fewer capes, promontories, points, bays, and creeks. Its form was very striking. When Spilett drew it they declared it was like some fantastic sea beast, some monstrous theropod, asleep on the surface of the Pacific. The exact configuration of the island may thus be described. The eastern coast, upon which the castaways had landed, was a decided curve, embracing a large bay, terminating at the southeast in a sharp promontory, which the shape of the land had hidden from Pencroff on his first exploration. On the northeast, two other capes shut in the bay, and between them lay a narrow gulf like the half-open jaws of some formidable dogfish. From northeast to northwest the coast was round and flat, like the skull of a wild beast, then came a sort of indeterminate hump, whose center was occupied by the volcanic mountain. From this point the coast ran directly north and south. For 2/3 of its length it was bordered by a narrow creek, then it finished in a long queue, like the tail of a gigantic alligator. This queue formed a veritable peninsula, which extended more than 30 miles into the sea, reckoning from the southeastern cape before mentioned. These 30 miles, the southern coast of the island, described an open bay. The narrowest part of the island, between the Chimneys and the creek, on the west, was 10 miles wide, but its greatest length, from the jaw in the northeast to the extremity of the southwestern peninsula, was not less than 30 miles. The general aspect of the interior was as follows: the southern part, from the shore to the mountain, was covered with woods, the northern part was arid and sandy. Between the volcano and the eastern coast the party were surprised to see a lake, surrounded by evergreens, whose existence they had not suspected. Viewed from such a height it seemed to be on the same level with the sea, but, on reflection, the engineer explained to his companions that it must be at least 300 feet higher, for the plateau on which it lay was as high as that of the coast. "So, then, it is a freshwater lake?" asked Pencroff. "Yes," said the engineer, "for it must be fed by the mountain streams." "I can see a little river flowing into it," said Herbert, pointing to a narrow brook whose source was evidently in the spurs of the western cliff. "True," said Smith, "and since this brook flows into the lake, there is probably some outlet towards the sea for the overflow. We will see about that when we go back." This little winding stream and the river so familiar to them were all the watercourses they could see. Nevertheless, it was possible that under those masses of trees which covered 2/3 of the island, other streams flowed towards the sea. This seemed the more probable from the fertility of the country and its magnificent display of the flora of the temperate zone. In the northern section there was no indication of running water. Perhaps there might be stagnant pools in the swampy part of the northeast, but that was all. In the main this region was composed of arid sand hills and downs, contrasting strongly with the fertility of the larger portion. The volcano did not occupy the center of the island. It rose in the northwest, and seemed to indicate the dividing line of the two zones. On the southwest, south, and southeast, the beginnings of the spurs were lost in masses of verdure. To the north, on the contrary, these ramifications were plainly visible, subsiding gradually to the level of the sandy plain. On this side, too, when the volcano was active, the eruptions had taken place, and a great bed of lava extended as far as the narrow jaw which formed the northeastern gulf. They remained for an hour at the summit of the mountain. The island lay stretched before them like a plan in relief, with its different tints: green for the forests, yellow for the sands, blue for the water. They understood the configuration of the entire island. Only the bottoms of the shady valleys and the depths of the narrow gorges between the spurs of the volcano, concealed by the spreading foliage, escaped their searching eye. There remained a question of great moment, whose answer would have a controlling influence upon the fortunes of the castaways. Was the island inhabited? It was the reporter who put this question, which seemed already to have been answered in the negative by the minute examination which they had just made of the different portions of the island. Nowhere could they perceive the handiwork of man, no late settlement on the beach, not even a lonely cabin or a fisherman's hut. No smoke, rising on the air, betrayed a human presence. It is true, the observers were 30 miles from the long peninsula which extended to the southwest, and upon which even Pencroff's eye could hardly have discovered a dwelling. Nor could they raise the curtain of foliage which covered 3/4 of the island to see whether some village lay sheltered there. But the natives of these little islands in the Pacific usually live on the coast, and the coast seemed absolutely desert. Until they should make a more complete exploration, they might assume that the island was uninhabited. But was it ever frequented by the inhabitants of neighboring islands? This question was difficult to answer. No land appeared within a radius of 50 miles. But 50 miles could easily be traversed by Malay canoes or by the larger pirogues of the Polynesians. Everything depended upon the situation of the island, on its isolation in the Pacific, or its proximity to the archipelagos. Could Smith succeed, without his instruments, in determining its latitude and longitude? It would be difficult, and in the uncertainty, they must take precautions against an attack from savage neighbors. The exploration of the island was finished, its configuration determined, a map of it drawn, its size calculated, and the distribution of its land and water ascertained. The forests and the plains had been roughly sketched upon the reporter's map. They had only now to descend the declivities of the mountain, and to examine into the animal, vegetable, and mineral resources of the country. But before giving the signal of departure, Cyrus Smith, in a calm, grave voice, addressed his companions. "Look, my friends, upon this little corner of the earth, on which the hand of the Almighty has cast us. Here, perhaps, we may long dwell. Perhaps, too, unexpected help will arrive, should some ship chance to pass. I say chance, because this island is of slight importance, without even a harbor for ships. I fear it is situated out of the usual course of vessels, too far south for those which frequent the archipelagos of the Pacific, too far north for those bound to Australia round Cape Horn. I will not disguise from you our situation." "And you are right, my dear Cyrus," said the reporter, eagerly. "You are dealing with men. They trust you, and you can count on them. Can he not, my friends?" "I will obey you in everything, Mr. Smith," said Herbert, taking the engineer's hand. "May I lose my name," said the sailor, "if I shirk my part." "If you choose, Mr. Smith, we will make a little America here. We will build cities, lay railroads, establish telegraphs, and someday, when the island is transformed and civilized, offer her to the United States. But one thing I should like to ask." "What is that?" said the reporter. "That we should not consider ourselves any longer as castaways, but as colonists." Cyrus Smith could not help smiling, and the motion was adopted. Then Smith thanked his companions, and added that he counted upon their energy and upon the help of heaven. "Well, let's start for the Chimneys," said Pencroff. "1 minute, my friends," answered the engineer. "Would it not be well to name the island, as well as the capes, promontories, and watercourses, which we see before us?" "Good," said the reporter. "That will simplify for the future the instructions which we may have to give or to take." "Yes," added the sailor, "it will be something gained to be able to say whence we are coming and where we are going. We shall seem to be somewhere." "At the Chimneys, for instance," said Herbert. "Exactly," said the sailor. "That name has been quite convenient already, and I was the author of it. Shall we keep that name for our first encampment, Mr. Smith?" "Yes, Pencroff, since you baptized it so." "Good. The others will be easy enough," resumed the sailor, who was now in the vein. "Let us give them names like those of the Swiss family Robinson, whose story Herbert has read me more than once, Providence Bay, Cocolot Point, Cape Disappointment. Or rather Mr. Smith's name, Mr. Spilett's, or N.E.B.'s," said Herbert. "My name?" cried N.E.B., showing his white teeth. "Why not?" replied Pencroff. "Port N.E.B. would sound first-rate." "And Cape Gideon?" "I would rather have names, taken from our country," said the reporter, "which will recall America to us." "Yes," said Smith, "the principal features, the bays and seas should be so named. For instance, let us call the Great Bay to the east Union Bay, the southern indentation Washington Bay, the mountain on which we are standing Mount Franklin, the lake beneath our feet Lake Grant. These names will recall our country and the great citizens who have honored it. But for the smaller features, let us choose names which will suggest their especial configuration. These will remain in our memory and be more convenient at the same time. The shape of the island is so peculiar that we shall have no trouble in finding appropriate names. The streams, the creeks, and the forest regions yet to be discovered we will baptize as they come. What say you, my friends?" The engineer's proposal was unanimously applauded. The inland bay unrolled like a map before their eyes, and they had only to name the features of its contour and relief. Spilett would put down the names over the proper places, and the geographical nomenclature of the island would be complete. First, they named the 2 bays and the mountain as the engineer had suggested. "Now," said the reporter, "to that peninsula projecting from the southwest I propose to give the name of Serpentine Peninsula, and to call the twisted curve at the termination of it Reptile End, for it is just like a snake's tail." "Motion carried," said the engineer. "And the other extremity of the island," said Herbert, "the gulf so like an open pair of jaws, let us call it Shark Gulf." "Good enough," said Pencroff, "and we may complete the figure by calling the 2 sides of the gulf Mandiable Cape." "But there are 2 capes," observed the reporter. "Well, we will have them North Mandiable and South Mandiable." "I've put them down," said Spilett. "Now we must name the southwestern extremity of the island," said Pencroff. "You mean the end of Union Bay?" asked Herbert. Claw Cape, suggested Neb, who wished to have his turn as godfather. And he had chosen an excellent name, for this cape was very like the powerful claw of the fantastic animal to which they had compared the island. Pencroff was enchanted with the turn things were taking, and their active imagination soon supplied other names. The river which furnished them with fresh water, and near which the balloon had cast them on shore, they called the Mercy, in gratitude to Providence. The islet on which they first set foot was Safety Island, the plateau at the top of the high granite wall above the Chimneys, from which the whole sweep of the bay was visible, Prospect Plateau, and, finally, that mass of impenetrable woods which covered Serpentine Peninsula, the forests of the far west. The engineer had approximately determined, by the height and position of the sun, the situation of the island with reference to the cardinal points, and had put Union Bay and Prospect Plateau to the east, but on the morrow, by taking the exact time of the sun's rising and setting, and noting its situation at the time exactly intermediate, he expected to ascertain precisely the northern point of the island, for, on account of its situation on the southern hemisphere, the sun at the moment of its culmination would pass to the north, and not to the south, as it does in the northern hemisphere. All was settled, and the colonists were about to descend the mountain, when Pencroff cried, "Why, what idiots we are!" "Why so?" said Spilett, who had gotten up and closed his notebook. "We have forgotten to baptize our island." Herbert was about to propose to give it the name of the engineer, and his companions would have applauded the choice, when Cyrus Smith said quietly, "Let us give it the name of a great citizen, my friends, of the defender of American unity. Let us call it Lincoln Island." They greeted the proposal with 3 hurrahs. Chapter 12. Regulation of watches. Pencroff is satisfied. A suspicious smoke, the course of Red Creek, the flora of the island, its fauna, mountain pheasants, a kangaroo chase, the agouti, Lake Grant, return to the Chimneys. The colonists of Lincoln Island cast a last look about them and walked once around the verge of the crater. Half an hour afterwards they were again upon the lower plateau, at their encampment of the previous night. Pencroff thought it was breakfast time, and so came up the question of regulating the watches of Smith and Spilett. The reporter's chronometer was uninjured by the sea water, as he had been cast high up on the sand beyond the reach of the waves. It was an admirable timepiece, a veritable pocket chronometer, and Spilett had wound it up regularly every day. The engineer's watch, of course, had stopped while he lay upon the downs. He now wound it up, and set it at 9 o'clock, estimating the time approximately by the height of the sun. Spilett was about to do the same, when the engineer stopped him. "Wait, my dear Spilett," said he. "You have the Richmond time, have you not?" "Yes." "Your watch, then, is regulated by the meridian of that city, which is very nearly that of Washington." "Certainly." "Well, keep it so. Wind it up carefully, but do not touch the hands. This may be of use to us." "What's the use of that?" thought the sailor. They made such a hearty meal, that little was left of the meat and pistachio nuts, but Pencroff did not trouble himself about that. Top, who had not been forgotten in the feast, would certainly find some new game in the thicket. Besides, the sailor had made up his mind to ask Smith to make some powder and 1 or 2 shotguns, which, he thought, would be an easy matter. As they were leaving the plateau, Smith proposed to his companions to take a new road back to the Chimneys. He wished to explore Lake Grant, which lay surrounded so beautifully with trees. They followed the crest of one of the spurs in which the creek which fed the lake probably had its source. The colonists employed in conversation only the proper names which they had just devised, and found that they could express themselves much more easily. Herbert and Pencroff, one of whom was young and the other something of a child, were delighted, and the sailor said as they walked along, "Well, Herbert, this is jolly. We can't lose ourselves now, my boy, since, whether we follow Lake Grant or get to the Mercy through the woods of the far west, we must come to Prospect Plateau, and so to Union Bay." It had been agreed that, without marching in a squad, the colonists should not keep too far apart. Dangerous wild beasts surely inhabited the forest recesses, and they must be on their guard. Usually Pencroff, Herbert, and Neb walked in front, preceded by Top, who poked his nose into every corner. The reporter and engineer walked together, the former ready to note down every incident, the latter seldom speaking, and turning aside only to pick up sometimes one thing, sometimes another, vegetable or mineral, which he put in his pocket without saying a word. "What the mischief is he picking up?" muttered Pencroff. "There's no use in looking, I see nothing worth the trouble of stooping for." About 10 o'clock the little company descended the last declivities of Mount Franklin. A few bushes and trees were scattered over the ground. They were walking on a yellowish, calcined soil, forming a plain about a mile long, which extended to the border of the wood. Large fragments of that basalt which, according to Biscoff's theory, has taken 350 million years to cool, strewed the uneven surface of the plain. Yet there was no trace of lava, which had especially found an exit down the northern declivities. Smith thought they should soon reach the creek, which he expected to find flowing under the trees by the plain, when he saw Herbert running back, and Neb and the sailor hiding themselves behind the rocks. "What's the matter, my boy?" said Spilett. "Smoke," answered Herbert. "We saw smoke ascending from among the rocks, 100 steps in front." "Men in this region?" cried the reporter. "We must not show ourselves till we know with whom we have to deal," answered Smith. "I have more fear than hope of the natives, if there are any such on the island." "Where is Top?" "Top is on ahead." "And has not barked?" "No, that is strange. Still, let us try to call him back." In a few moments the three had rejoined their companions, and had hidden themselves, like Neb and Pencroff, behind the basalt rubbish. Thence they saw, very evidently, a yellowish smoke curling into the air. Top was recalled by a low whistle from his master, who motioned to his comrades to wait, and stole forward under cover of the rocks. In perfect stillness the party awaited the result, when a call from Smith summoned them forward. In a moment they were by his side, and were struck at once by the disagreeable smell which pervaded the atmosphere. This odor, unmistakable as it was, had been sufficient to reassure the engineer. "Nature is responsible for that fire," he said, "or rather for that smoke. It is nothing but a sulphur spring, which will be good for our sore throats." "Good," said Pencroff, "what a pity I have not a cold." The colonists walked towards the smoke. There they beheld a spring of sulphate of soda, which flowed in currents among the rocks, and whose waters, absorbing the oxygen of the air, gave off a lively odor of sulfohydric acid. Smith dipped his hand into the spring and found it oily. He tasted it, and perceived a sweetish savor. Its temperature he estimated at 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and when Herbert asked him on what he based his estimate, "Simply, my boy," said he, "because when I put my hand into this water, I have no sensation either of heat or of cold. Therefore, it is at the same temperature as the human body, that is, about 95 degrees. Then, as the spring of sulphur could be put to no present use, the colonists walked towards the thick border of the forest, a few hundred paces distant. There, as they had thought, the brook rolled its bright limpid waters between high, reddish banks, whose color betrayed the presence of oxide of iron. On account of this color, they instantly named the water course Red Creek. It was nothing but a large mountain brook, deep and clear, here, flowing quietly over the lands, there, gurgling amid rocks, or falling in a cascade, but always flowing towards the lake. It was 1.5 miles long, its breadth varied from 30 to 40 feet. Its water was fresh, which argued that those of the lake would be found the same, a fortunate occurrence, in case they should find upon its banks a more comfortable dwelling than the Chimneys. The trees which, a few hundred paces downstream overshadowed the banks of the creek, belonged principally to the species which abound in the temperate zone of Australia or of Tasmania, and belonged to those conifers which clothed the portion of the island already explored, some miles around Prospect Plateau. It was now the beginning of April, a month which corresponds in that hemisphere to our October, yet their leaves had not begun to fall. They were, especially, casuarina and eucalypti, some of which, in the ensuing spring, would furnish a sweetish manner like that of the East. Clumps of Australian cedars rose in the glades, covered high with that sort of moss which the New Hollanders call tussocks, but the cocoa palm, so abundant in the archipelagos of the Pacific, was conspicuous by its absence. Probably the latitude of the island was too low. "What a pity," said Herbert, "such a useful tree and such splendid nuts." There were flocks of birds on the thin boughs of the eucalypti and the casuarina, which gave fine play to their wings. Black, white, and grey cockatoos, parrots and parakeets of all colors, kingbirds, birds of paradise, of brilliant green, with a crowd of red and blue lories, glowing with every prismatic color, flew about with deafening clamors. All at once, a strange volley of discordant sounds seemed to come from the thicket. The colonists heard, one after another, the song of birds, the cries of four-footed beasts, and a sort of clucking sound strangely human. Neb and Herbert rushed towards the thicket, forgetting the most elementary rules of prudence. Happily, there was neither formidable wild beast nor savage native, but merely half a dozen of those mocking birds which they recognized as mountain pheasants. A few skillfully aimed blows with a stick brought this parody to an end, and gave them excellent game for dinner that evening. Herbert also pointed out superb pigeons with bronze-colored wings, some with a magnificent crest, others clad in green, like their congeners at Port Macquarie, but like the troops of crows and magpies which flew about, they were beyond reach. A load of small shot would have killed hosts of them, but the colonists had nothing but stones and sticks, very insufficient weapons. They proved even more inadequate when a troop of quadrupeds leaped away through the underbrush with tremendous bounds 30 feet long, so that they almost seemed to spring from tree to tree, like squirrels. "Kangaroos!" cried Herbert. "Can you eat them?" said Pencroff. "They make a delicious stew," said the reporter. The words had hardly escaped his lips, when the sailor, with Neb and Herbert at his heels, rushed after the kangaroos. Smith tried in vain to recall them, but equally in vain did they pursue the game, whose elastic leaps left them far behind. After 5 minutes' chase, they gave it up, out of breath. "You see, Mr. Smith," said Pencroff, "that guns are a necessity. Will it be possible to make them?" "Perhaps," replied the engineer, "but we will begin by making bows and arrows, and you will soon use them as skillfully as the Australian hunters." "Bows and arrows," said Pencroff, with a contemptuous look. "They are for children." "Don't be so proud, my friend," said the reporter. "Bows and arrows were sufficient for many centuries for the warfare of mankind. Powder is an invention of yesterday, while war, unhappily, is as old as the race." "That's true, Mr. Spilett," said the sailor. "I always speak before I think. Forgive me." Meanwhile Herbert, with his natural history always uppermost in his thoughts, returned to the subject of kangaroos. "Those which escaped us," he said, "belong to the species most difficult to capture, very large, with long grey hair, but I am sure there are black and red kangaroos, rock kangaroos, kangaroo rats." "Herbert," said the sailor, "for me there is only one kind, the kangaroo on the spit, and that is just what we haven't got." They could not help laughing at Professor Pencroff's new classification. He was much cast down at the prospect of dining on mountain pheasants, but chance was once more kind to him. Top, who felt his dinner at stake, rushed hither and thither, his instinct quickened by sharp appetite. In fact, he would have left very little of what he might catch or anyone else, had not Neb watched him shrewdly. About 3 o'clock he disappeared into the rushes, from which came grunts and growls which indicated a deadly tussle. Neb rushed in, and found Top greedily devouring an animal, which in 10 seconds more would have totally disappeared. But the dog had luckily fallen on a litter, and 2 more rodents, for to this species did the beasts belong, lay strangled on the ground. Neb reappeared in triumph with a rodent in each hand. They had yellow hair, with patches of green, and the rudiments of a tail. They were a sort of agouti, a little larger than their tropical congeners, true American hares, with long ears and 5 molar teeth on either side. "Hurrah!" cried Pencroff, "the roast is here, now we can go back to the house." The journey was resumed. Red Creek still rolled its limped waters under the arching boughs of casuarents, bankseas and gigantic gum trees. Superb liliaceae rose, to a height of 20 feet, and other arborescent trees of species unknown to the young naturalist, bent over the brook, which murmured gently beneath its leafy cradle. It widened sensibly, nevertheless, and the mouth was evidently near. As the party emerged from a massive thicket of fine trees, the lake suddenly appeared before them. They were now on its left bank, and a picturesque region opened to their view. The smooth sheet of water, about 7 miles in circumference and 250 acres in extent, lay sleeping among the trees. Towards the east, across the intermittent screen of verdure, appeared a shining horizon of sea. To the north the curve of the lake was concave, contrasting with the sharp outline of its lower extremity. Numerous aquatic birds frequented the banks of this little Ontario, in which the thousand isles of its American original were represented by a rock emerging from its surface some hundreds of feet from the southern bank. There lived in harmony several couples of kingfishers, perched upon rocks, grave and motionless, watching for fish. Then they would plunge into the water and dive with a shrill cry, reappearing with the prey in their beaks. Upon the banks of the lake and the island were constantly strutting wild ducks, pelicans, water hens and redbeaks. The waters of the lake were fresh and limpid, somewhat dark, and from the concentric circles on its surface, were evidently full of fish. "How beautiful this lake is," said Spilett. "We could live on its banks." "We will live there," answered Smith. The colonists, desiring to get back to the Chimneys by the shortest route, went down towards the angle formed at the south by the junction of the banks. They broke a path with much labor through the thickets and brushwood, hitherto untouched by the hand of man, and walked towards the seashore, so as to strike it to the north of Prospect Plateau. After a 2 miles walk they came upon the thick turf of the plateau, and saw before them the infinite ocean. To get back to the Chimneys they had to walk across the plateau for a mile to the elbow formed by the first bend of the Mersey. But the engineer was anxious to know how and where the overflow of the lake escaped. It was probable that a river existed somewhere pouring through a gorge in the granite. In fine, the lake was an immense receptacle gradually filled at the expense of the creek, and its overflow must somehow find a way down to the sea. Why should they not utilize this wasted store of water power? So they walked up the plateau, following the banks of Lake Grant, but after a tramp of a mile, they could find no outlet. It was now 4:30, and dinner had yet to be prepared. The party returned upon its track, and reached the Chimneys by the left bank of the Mersey. Then the fire was lighted, and Neb and Pencroff, on whom devolved the cooking, in their respective characters of negro and sailor, skillfully broiled the agouti, to which the hungry explorers did great honor. When the meal was over, and just as they were settling themselves to sleep, Smith drew from his pocket little specimens of various kinds of minerals, and said quietly, "My friends, this is iron ore, this pyrites, this clay, this limestone, this charcoal. Nature gives us these as her part in the common task. Tomorrow we must do our share." Chapter 13. Top's contribution: making bows and arrows, a brick kiln, a pottery, different cooking utensils. The first. Boiled meat, mugwort, the Southern Cross, an important astronomical observation. "Now then, Mr. Smith, where shall we begin?" asked Pencroff the next morning. "At the beginning," answered the engineer. And this, indeed, was necessary, as the colonists did not even possess implements with which to make implements. Neither were they in that condition of nature which having time economizes effort. The necessities of life must be provided for at once, and, if profiting by experience they had nothing to invent, at least they had everything to make. Their iron and steel was in the ore, their pottery was in the clay, their linen and clothes were still to be provided. It must be remembered, however, that these colonists were men, in the best sense of the word. The engineer Smith could not have been aided by comrades more intelligent, or more devoted and zealous. He had questioned them, and knew their ability. The reporter, having learned everything so as to be able to speak of everything, would contribute largely from his knowledge and skill towards the settlement of the island. He would not shirk work, and, a thorough sportsman, he would follow as a business what he had formerly indulged in as a pastime. Herbert, a manly lad, already well versed in natural science, would contribute his share to the common cause. Neb was devotion personified. Adroit, intelligent, indefatigable, robust, of iron constitution, knowing something of the work in a smithy, his assistance would be considerable. As to Pencroff, he had sailed every sea, had been a carpenter in the Brooklyn yards, an assistant tailor on board ship, and, during high leaves of absence, a gardener, farmer, etc. In short, like every sailor, he was a jack of all trades. Indeed, it would have been hard to bring together 5 men, more able to struggle against fate, and more certain to triumph in the end. At the beginning, Smith had said. And this beginning was the construction of an apparatus which would serve to transform the natural substances. Everyone knows what an important part heat plays in these transformations. Therefore, as wood and coal were already provided, it was only necessary to make an oven to utilize them. What good is an oven? Asked Pencroff. To make the pottery that we want, replied Smith. And how will we make an oven? With bricks. And how will we make the bricks? With the clay. Come, friends. We will set up our factory at the place of production, so as to avoid carriage. Neb will bring the provisions, and we shall not lack fire to cook food. No, replied the reporter, but suppose we lack food, since we have no hunting implements. If we only had a knife, cried the sailor. What, then? Asked Smith. Why, I would make a bow and arrows. And game would be plenty in the larder. A knife. Something that will cut, said the engineer, as if talking to himself. Suddenly his face brightened. Come here, Top, he called. The dog bounded to his master, and Smith, having taken off the collar which the animal had around his neck, broke it into halves, saying, Here are 2 knives, Pencroff. For all response, the sailor gave a couple of cheers. Top's collar was made from a thin piece of tempered steel. All that was therefore necessary was to rub it to an edge upon a sandstone, and then to sharpen it upon one of finer grain. These kind of stones were readily procurable upon the beach, and in a couple of hours the implements of the colony consisted of 2 strong blades, which it was easy to fasten into solid handles. The overcoming of this first difficulty was greeted as a triumph, and it was indeed a fortunate event. On setting out, it was the intention of the engineer to return to the western bank of the lake, where he had noticed the clay, of which he had secured a specimen. Following the bank of the Mersey, they crossed Prospect Plateau, and after a walk of about 5 miles, they arrived at a glade some 200 paces distant from Lake Grant. On the way, Herbert had discovered a tree from which the South American Indians make boughs. It was the crejimber of the palm family. From it they cut long straight branches, which they peeled and shaped into boughs. For cords they took the fibers of the Hibiscus heterophyllus, Indian hemp, a malvaceous plant, the fibers of which are as strong as the tendons of an animal. Pencroff, having thus provided boughs, only needed arrows. Those were easily made from straight, stiff branches, free from knots, but it was not so easy to arm them with a substitute for iron. But Pencroff said that he had accomplished this much, and that chance would do the rest. The party had reached the place discovered the day before. The ground was composed of that clay which is used in making bricks and tiles, and was therefore just the thing for their purpose. The labor was not difficult. It was only necessary to scour the clay with sand, mold the bricks, and then bake them before a wood fire. Usually, bricks are pressed in molds, but the engineer contented himself with making these by hand. All this day and the next was employed in this work. The clay, soaked in water, was kneaded by the hands and feet of the manipulators, and then divided into blocks of equal size. A skilled workman can make, without machinery, as many as 10,000 bricks in 12 hours, but in the 2 days the brickmakers of Lincoln Island had made but 3,000, which were piled one upon the other to await the time when they would be dry enough to bake, which would be in 3 or 4 days. On the 2nd of April, Smith occupied himself in determining the position of the island. The day before he had noted the precise minute at which the sun had set, allowing for the refraction. On this morning, he ascertained with equal precision the time of its rising. The intervening time was 12 hours and 24 minutes. Therefore 6 hours and 12 minutes after rising the sun would pass the meridian, and the point in the sky which it would occupy at that instant would be north. At the proper hour Smith marked this point, and by getting 2 trees in line obtained a meridian for his future operations. During the 2 days preceding the baking they occupied themselves by laying in a supply of firewood. Branches were cut from the edge of the clearing, and all the dead wood under the trees was picked up. And now and then they hunted in the neighborhood, the more successfully, as Pencroff had some dozens of arrows with very sharp points. It was Top who had provided these points by bringing in a porcupine, poor game enough, but of an undeniable value, thanks to the quills with which it bristled. These quills were firmly fastened to the ends of the arrows, and their flight was guided by feathering them with the cockatoo's feathers. The reporter and Herbert soon became expert marksmen, and all kinds of game, such as cabias, pigeons, agatis, heathcock, etc., abounded at the chimneys. Most of these were killed in that part of the forest upon the left bank of the Mersey, which they had called Jacama Wood, after the kingfisher which Pencroff and Herbert had pursued there during their first exploration. The meat was eaten fresh, but they preserved the hams of the cabiai by smoking them before a fire of green wood, having made them aromatic with odorous leaves. Thus, they had nothing but roast after roast, and they would have been glad to have heard a pot singing upon the hearth, but first they must have the pot, and for this they must have the oven. During these excursions, the hunters noticed the recent tracks of large animals, armed with strong claws, but they could not tell their species, and Smith cautioned them to be prudent, as, doubtless, there were dangerous beasts in the forest. He was right. For one day Spilett and Herbert saw an animal resembling a jaguar. But, fortunately, the beast did not attack them, as they could hardly have killed it without being themselves wounded. But, Spilett promised, if he should ever obtain a proper weapon, such as one of the guns Pencroff begged for, that he would wage relentless war on all ferocious beasts and rid the island of their presence. They did not do anything to the chimneys, as the engineer hoped to discover, or to build, if need be, a more convenient habitation, but contented themselves by spreading fresh quantities of moss and dry leaves upon the sand in the corridors, and upon these primitive beds the tired workmen slept soundly. They also reckoned the days already passed on Lincoln Island, and began keeping a calendar. On the 5th of April, which was a Wednesday, they had been 12 days upon the island. On the morning of the 6th, the engineer with his companions met at the place where the bricks were to be baked. Of course the operation was to be conducted in the open air, and not in an oven, or, rather, the pile of bricks would in itself form a bake oven. Carefully prepared faggots were laid upon the ground, surrounding the tiers of dry bricks, which formed a great cube, in which air holes had been left. The work occupied the whole day, and it was not until evening that they lit the fire, which all night long they kept supplied with fuel. The work lasted 48 hours, and succeeded perfectly. Then, as it was necessary to let the smoking mass cool, Neb and Pencroff, directed by Mr. Smith, brought, on a hurdle made of branches, numerous loads of limestone which they found scattered in abundance to the north of the lake. These stones, decomposed by heat, furnished a thick quicklime, which increased in bulk by slacking, and was fully as pure as if it had been produced by the calcination of chalk or marble. Mixed with sand in order to diminish its shrinkage while drying, this lime made an excellent mortar. By the 9th of April the engineer had at his disposal a quantity of lime, all prepared, and some thousands of bricks. They, therefore, began at once the construction of an oven, in which to bake their pottery. This was accomplished without much difficulty, and, 5 days later, the oven was supplied with coal from the open vein, which the engineer had discovered near the mouth of Red Creek, and the first smoke escaped from a chimney 20 feet high. The glade was transformed into a manufactory, and Pencroff was ready to believe that all the products of modern industry would be produced from this oven. Meantime the colonists made a mixture of the clay with lime and quartz, forming pipe clay, from which they molded pots and mugs, plates and jars, tubs to hold water, and cooking vessels. Their form was rude and defective, but after they had been baked at a high temperature, the kitchen of the chimneys found itself provided with utensils as precious as if they were composed of the finest kaolin. We must add that Pencroff, desirous of knowing whether this material deserved its name of pipe clay, made some large pipes, which he would have found perfect, but for the want of tobacco. And, indeed, this was a great privation to the sailor. But the tobacco will come like everything else, he would say in his hopeful moments. The work lasted until the 15th of April, and the time was well spent. The colonists, having become potters, made nothing but pottery. When it would suit the engineer to make them smiths, they would be smiths. But as the morrow would be Sunday, and moreover Easter Sunday, all agreed to observe the day by rest. These Americans were religious men, scrupulous observers of the precepts of the Bible, and their situation could only develop their trust in the author of all things. On the evening of the 15th they returned permanently to the Chimneys, bringing the rest of the pottery back with them, and putting out the oven fire until there should be use for it again. This return was marked by the fortunate discovery by the engineer of a substance that would answer for tinder, which, we know, is the spongy, velvety pulp of a mushroom of the polypore family. Properly prepared it is extremely inflammable, especially when previously saturated with gunpowder, or nitrate or chlorate of potash. But until then they had found no polypores, nor any fungi that would answer instead. Now, the engineer, having found a certain plant belonging to the mugwort family, to which belong wormwood, mint, etc., broke off some tufts, and, handing them to the sailor, said, "Here, Pencroff, is something for you." Pencroff examined the plant, with its long silky threads and leaves covered with a cotton-like down. "What is it, Mr. Smith?" he asked. "Ah, I know. It's tobacco." "No," answered Smith, "it is Artemisia wormwood, known to science as Chinese mugwort, but to us it will be tinder." This mugwort, properly dried, furnished a very inflammable substance, especially after the engineer had impregnated it with nitrate of potash, which is the same as saltpetre, a mineral very plenty on the island. This evening the colonists, seated in the central chamber, supped with comfort. Neb had prepared some agouti soup, a spiced ham, and the boiled corms of the Caladium macroitzum, an herbaceous plant of the arid family, which under the tropics takes a tree form. These corms, which are very nutritious, had an excellent flavor, something like that of Portland sago, and measurably supplied the place of bread, which the colonists were still without. Supper finished, before going to sleep the party took a stroll upon the beach. It was 8 o'clock, and the night was magnificent. The moon, which had been full 5 days before, was about rising, and in the zenith, shining resplendent above the circumpolar constellations, rode the Southern Cross. For some moments the engineer gazed at it attentively. At its summit and base were 2 stars of the first magnitude, and on the left arm and the right, stars, respectively, of the second magnitude and the third. Then, after some reflection, he said, "Herbert, is not today the 15th of April?" "Yes, sir," answered the lad. "Then, if I am not mistaken, tomorrow will be one of the 4 days in the year when the mean and real time are the same, that is to say, my boy, that tomorrow, within some seconds of noon by the clocks, the sun will pass the meridian. If, therefore, the weather is clear, I think I will be able to obtain the longitude of the island within a few degrees." "Without a sextant or instruments?" asked Spilett. "Yes," replied the engineer. "And since it is so clear, I will try tonight to find our latitude by calculating the height of the cross, that is, of the southern pole, above the horizon. You see, my friends, before settling down, it will not do to be content with determining this land to be an island, we must find out its locality. Indeed, instead of building a house, it will be better to build a ship, if we are within 100 miles of an inhabited land. That is why I am now going to try to get the latitude of the place, and tomorrow noon to calculate the longitude." If the engineer had possessed a sextant, the work would have been easy, as this evening, by taking the height of the pole, and tomorrow by the sun's passage of the meridian, he would have the coordinates of the island. But, having no instruments, he must devise something. So returning to the Chimneys, he made, by the light of the fire, 2 little flat sticks which he fastened together with a thorn, in a way that they could be opened and shut like compasses, and returned with them to the beach. But as the sea horizon was hidden from this point by Claw Cape, the engineer determined to make his observation from Prospect Plateau, leaving, until the next day, the computation of the height of the latter, which could easily be done by elementary geometry. The colonists, therefore, went to the edge of the plateau which faced the southeast, overlooking the fantastic rocks bordering the shore. The place rose some 50 feet above the right bank of the Mersey, which descended, by a double slope, to the end of Claw Cape and to the southern boundary of the island. Nothing obstructed the vision, which extended over half the horizon from the cape to Reptile Promontory. To the south, this horizon, lit by the first rays of the moon, was sharply defined against the sky. The cross was at this time reversed, the star Alpha being nearest the pole. This constellation is not situated as near to the southern as the polar star is to the northern pole, Alpha is about 27 degrees from it, but Smith knew this and could calculate accordingly. He took care also to observe it at the instant when it passed the meridian under the pole, thus simplifying the operation. The engineer opened the arms of his compass so that one pointed to the horizon and the other to the star, and thus obtained the angle of distance which separated them. And in order to fix this distance immovably, he fastened these arms, respectively, by means of thorns, to a cross piece of wood. This done, it was only necessary to calculate the angle obtained, bringing the observation to the level of the sea so as to allow for the depression of the horizon caused by the height of the plateau. The measurement of this angle would thus give the height of alpha, or the pole, above the horizon, or, since the latitude of a point on the globe is always equal to the height of the pole above the horizon at that point, the latitude of the island. This calculation was postponed until the next day, and by 10 o'clock everybody slept profoundly. Chapter 14. The measure of the granite wall, an application of the theorem of similar triangles, the latitude of the island. An excursion to the north, an oyster bed, plans for the future, the sun's passage of the meridian, the coordinates of Lincoln Island. At daybreak the next day, Easter Sunday, the colonists left the chimneys and went to wash their linen and clean their clothing. The engineer intended to make some soap as soon as he could obtain some soda or potash and grease oil. The important question of renewing their wardrobes would be considered in due time. At present they were strong, and able to stand hard wear for at least 6 months longer. But everything depended on the situation of the island as regarded inhabited countries, and that would be determined this day, providing the weather permitted. The sun rising above the horizon, ushered in one of those glorious days which seem like the farewell of summer. The first thing to be done was to measure the height of Prospect Plateau above the sea. "Do you not need another pair of compasses?" asked Herbert, of the engineer. "No, my boy," responded the latter, "this time we will try another and nearly as precise a method." Pencroff, Neb, and the reporter were busy at other things, but Herbert, who desired to learn, followed the engineer, who proceeded along the beach to the base of the granite wall. Smith was provided with a pole 12 feet long, carefully measured off from his own height, which he knew to a hair. Herbert carried a plumb line made from a flexible fiber tied to a stone. Having reached a point 20 feet from the shore and 500 feet from the perpendicular granite wall, Smith sunk the pole 2 feet in the sand, and, steadying it carefully, proceeded to make it plumb with the horizon. Then, moving back to a spot where, stretched upon the sand, he could sight over the top of the pole to the edge of the cliff, bringing the 2 points in line, he carefully marked this place with a stone. Then addressing Herbert, "Do you know the first principles of geometry?" said he. "Slightly, sir," answered Herbert, not wishing to seem forward. "Then you remember the relation of similar triangles?" "Yes, sir," answered Herbert. "Their like sides are proportional." "Right, my boy. And I have just constructed 2 similar right-angled triangles. The smaller has for its sides the perpendicular pole and the distances from its base and top to the stake, the second has the wall which we are about to measure, and the distances from its base and summit to the stake, which are only the prolongation of the base and hypotenuse of the first triangle." "I understand," cried Herbert. "As the distance from the stake to the pole is proportional to the distance from the stake to the base of the wall, so the height of the wall is proportional to the height of the rod." "Exactly," replied the engineer, "and after measuring the first 2 distances, as we know the height of the pole, we have only to calculate the proportion in order to find the height of the wall." The measurements were made with the pole and resulted in determining the distances from the stake to the foot of the pole and the base of the wall to be 15 and 500 feet respectively. The engineer and Herbert then returned to the chimneys, where the former, using a flat stone and a bit of shell to figure with, determined the height of the wall to be 333.33 feet. Then taking the compasses, and carefully measuring the angle which he had obtained the night before, upon a circle which he had divided into 360 parts, the engineer found that this angle, allowing for the differences already explained, was 53 degrees. Which, subtracted from 90 degrees, the distance of the pole from the equator, gave 37 degrees as the latitude of Lincoln Island. And making an allowance of 5 degrees for the imperfections of the observations, Smith concluded it to be situated between the 35th and the 40th parallel of south latitude. But, in order to establish the coordinates of the island, the longitude also must be taken. And this the engineer determined to do when the sun passed the meridian at noon. They therefore resolved to spend the morning in a walk, or rather an exploration of that part of the island situated to the north of Shark Gulf and the lake, and, if they should have time, to push on as far as the western side of South Mandiable Cape. They would dine on the downs and not return until evening. At 8:30 the little party set out, following the edge of the channel. Opposite, upon Safety Islet, a number of birds of the Sphemiscus family strutted gravely about. There were divers, easily recognizable, by their disagreeable cry, which resembled the braying of an ass. Pencroff, regarding them with gastronomic intent, was pleased to learn that their flesh, though dark-colored, was good to eat. They could also see amphibious animals, which probably were seals, crawling over the sand. It was not possible to think of these as food, as their oily flesh is detestable. Nevertheless Smith observed them carefully, and without disclosing his plans to the others, he announced that they would very soon make a visit to the island. The shore followed by the colonists was strewn with mollusks, which would have delighted a malacologist. But, what was more important, Neb discovered, about 4 miles from the Chimneys, among the rocks, a bed of oysters, left bare by the tide. Neb hasn't lost his day, said Pencroff, who saw that the bed extended some distance. It is, indeed, a happy discovery, remarked the reporter. And when we remember that each oyster produces 50 or 60,000 eggs a year, the supply is evidently inexhaustible. But I don't think the oyster is very nourishing, said Herbert. No, answered Smith. Oysters contain very little azote, and it would be necessary for a man living on them alone to eat at least 15 or 16 dozen every day. Well, said Pencroff, we could swallow dozens and dozens of these and not exhaust the bed. Shall we have some for breakfast? And, without waiting for an answer, which he well knew would be affirmative, the sailor and Neb detached a quantity of these mollusks from the rocks, and placed them with the other provisions for breakfast, in a basket which Neb had made from the hibiscus fibers. Then they continued along the shore between the downs and the sea. From time to time Smith looked at his watch, so as to be ready for the noon observation. All this portion of the island, as far as South Mandiable Cape, was desert, composed of nothing but sand and shells, mixed with the debris of lava. A few seabirds, such as the seagulls and albatross, frequented the shore, and some wild ducks excited the covetousness of Pencroff. He tried to shoot some, but unsuccessfully, as they seldom lit, and he could not hit them flying. This made the sailor say to the engineer, "You see, Mr. Smith, how much we need guns." "Doubtless," Pencroff answered the reporter, "but it rests with you. You find iron for the barrels, steel for the locks, saltpetre, charcoal and sulfur for the powder, mercury and nitric acid for the fulminate, and last of all, lead for the balls, and Mr. Smith will make us guns of the best quality." "Oh, we could probably find all these substances on the island," said the engineer. "But it requires fine tools to make such a delicate instrument as a firearm. However, we will see after a while. Why did we throw the arms and everything else, even our penknives, out of the balloon?" cried Pencroff. "If we hadn't, the balloon would have thrown us into the sea," answered Herbert. "So it would, my boy," answered the sailor, and then another idea occurring to him. "I wonder what Mr. Forster and his friend thought," he said, the next day, when they found the balloon had escaped. "I don't care what they thought," said the reporter. "It was my plan," cried Pencroff, with a satisfied air. "And a good plan it was," Pencroff interrupted the reporter, laughing, "to drop us here. I had rather be here than in the hands of the Southerners," exclaimed the sailor, "especially since Mr. Smith has been kind enough to rejoin us." "And I, too," cried the reporter. "After all, what do we lack here? Nothing." "That means everything," answered the sailor, laughing and shrugging his shoulders. "But some day we will get away from this place." "Sooner, perhaps, than you think, my friends," said the engineer, "if Lincoln Island is not very far from an inhabited archipelago or a continent. And we will find that out within an hour. I have no map of the Pacific, but I have a distinct recollection of its southern portion. Yesterday's observation places the island in the latitude of New Zealand and Chile. but the distance between these two countries is at least 6,000 miles. We must therefore determine what point in this space the island occupies, and that I hope to get pretty soon from the longitude. Is not the low archipelago nearest us in latitude? Asked Herbert. Yes, replied the engineer, but it is more than 1,200 miles distant. And that way? Inquired Neb, who followed the conversation with great interest, pointing towards the south. Nothing, answered Pencroff. Nothing, indeed, added the engineer. Well, Cyrus, demanded the reporter, if we find Lincoln Island to be only 200 or 300 miles from New Zealand or Chile, we will build a ship instead of a house, and Pencroff shall command it. All right, Mr. Smith, cried the sailor, I am all ready to be captain, provided you build something seaworthy. We will, if it is necessary, answered Smith. While these men, whom nothing could discourage, were talking, the hour for taking the observation approached. Herbert could not imagine how Mr. Smith would be able to ascertain the time of the sun's passage of the meridian of the island without a single instrument. It was 11 o'clock, and the party, halting about 6 miles from the Chimneys, not far from the place where they had found the engineer after his inexplicable escape, set about preparing breakfast. Herbert found fresh water in a neighboring brook, and brought some back in a vessel which Neb had with him. Meantime, the engineer made ready for his astronomical observation. He chose a smooth dry place upon the sand, which the sea had left perfectly level. It was no more necessary, however, for it to be horizontal, than for the rod which he stuck in the sand to be perpendicular. Indeed, the engineer inclined the rod towards the south or away from the sun, as it must not be forgotten that the colonists of Lincoln Island, being in the southern hemisphere, saw the orb of day describe his diurnal arc above the northern horizon. Then Herbert understood how by means of the shadow of the rod on the sand, the engineer would be able to ascertain the culmination of the sun, that is to say, its passage of the meridian of the island, or, in other words, the time of the place. For the moment that the shadow obtained its minimum length it would be noon, and all they had to do was to watch carefully the end of the shadow. By inclining the rod from the sun, Smith had made the shadow longer, and therefore its changes could be the more readily noted. When he thought it was time, the engineer knelt down upon the sand and began marking the decrease in the length of the shadow by means of little wooden pegs. His companions, bending over him, watched the operation with the utmost interest. The reporter, chronometer in hand, stood ready to mark the minute when the shadow would be shortest. Now, as this 16th of April was a day when the true and mean time are the same, Spilett's watch would give the true time of Washington, and greatly simplify the calculation. Meantime the shadow diminished little by little, and as soon as Smith perceived it begin to lengthen he exclaimed, "Now." 1 minute past 5, answered the reporter. Nothing then remained but the easy work of summing up the result. There was, as we have seen, 5 hours difference between the meridian of Washington and that of the island. Now, the sun passes around the earth at the rate of 15 degrees an hour. 15 multiplied by 5 gives 75. And as Washington is in 77 degrees 311 from the meridian of Greenwich, it follows that the island was in the neighborhood of longitude 152 degrees west. Smith announced this result to his companions, and, making the same allowance as before, he was able to affirm that the bearing of the island was between the 35 degrees and 37 degrees of south latitude, and between the 150 degrees and 155 degrees of west longitude. The difference in this calculation, attributable to errors in observation, was placed, as we have seen, at 5 degrees or 300 miles in each direction. But this error did not influence the conclusion that Lincoln Island was so far from any continent or archipelago that they could not attempt to accomplish the distance in a small boat. In fact, according to the engineer, they were at least 1,200 miles from Tahiti and from the Low Archipelago, fully 1,800 miles from New Zealand, and more than 4,500 miles from the coast of America. And when Cyrus Smith searched his memory, he could not remember any island in the Pacific occupying the position of Lincoln Island. Chapter 15. Winter sets in, the metallurgic question, the exploration of Safety Island, a seal hunt, capture of an echidna, the AI, the Catalonian method, making iron and steel. The first words of the sailor, on the morning of the 17th of April, were, "Well, what are we going to do today?" "Whatever Mr. Smith chooses," answered the reporter. The companions of the engineer, having been brickmakers and potters, were about to become metal workers. The previous day, after lunch, the party had explored as far as the extremity of Mandiable Cape, some 7 miles from the Chimneys. The extensive downs here came to an end and the soil appeared volcanic. There were no longer high walls, as at Prospect Plateau, but the narrow gulf between the two capes was then framed by a fantastic border of the mineral matter discharged from the volcano. Having reached this point, the colonists retraced their steps to the Chimneys, but they could not sleep until the question whether they should look forwards to leaving Lincoln Island had been definitely settled. The 1,200 miles to the Low Archipelago was a long distance. And now, at the beginning of the stormy season, a small boat would certainly not be able to accomplish it. The building of a boat, even when the proper tools are provided, is a difficult task, and as the colonists had none of these, the first thing to do was to make hammers, hatchets, adzes, saws, augers, planes, etc., which would take some time. It was therefore decided to winter on Lincoln Island, and to search for a more comfortable dwelling than the Chimneys in which to live during the inclement weather. The first thing was to utilize the iron ore which the engineer had discovered, by transforming it into iron and steel. Iron ore is usually found in combination with oxygen or sulfur. And it was so in this instance, as of the two specimens brought back by Cyrus Smith, one was magnetic iron, and the other pyrites or sulfurate of iron. Of these, it was the first kind, the magnetic ore, or oxide of iron, which must be reduced by coal, that is to say, freed from the oxygen, in order to obtain the pure metal. This reduction is performed by submitting the ore to a great heat, either by the Catalonian method, which has the advantage of producing the metal at one operation, or by means of blast furnaces which first smelt the ore, and then the iron, carrying off the 3 or 4% of coal combined with it. The engineer wanted to obtain iron in the shortest way possible. The ore he had found was in itself very pure and rich. Such ore is found in rich grey masses, yielding a black dust crystallized in regular octahedrons, highly magnetic, and in Europe the best quality of iron is made from it. Not far from this vein was the coal field previously explored by the colonists, so that every facility existed for the treatment of the ore. "Then, sir, are we going to work the iron?" questioned Pencroff. "Yes, my friend," answered the engineer. "But first we will do something I think you will enjoy, have a seal hunt on the island." "A seal hunt?" cried the sailor, addressing Spilett. "Do we need seals to make iron?" "It seems so, since Cyrus has said it," replied the reporter. But as the engineer had already left the Chimneys, Pencroff prepared for the chase without gaining an explanation. Soon the whole party were gathered upon the beach at a point where the channel could be forded at low water without wading deeper than the knees. This was Smith's first visit to the islet upon which his companions had been thrown by the balloon. On their landing, hundreds of penguins looked fearlessly at them, and the colonists armed with clubs could have killed numbers of these birds, but it would have been useless slaughter, and it would not do to frighten the seals which were lying on the sand some cable lengths away. They respected also certain innocent-looking sphemiscus, with flattened side appendages, mere apologies for wings, and covered with scale-like vestiges of feathers. The colonists marched stealthily forward over ground riddled with holes which formed the nests of aquatic birds. Towards the end of the island, black objects, like moving rocks, appeared above the surface of the water. They were the seals the hunters wished to capture. It was necessary to allow them to land, as, owing to their shape, these animals, although capital swimmers and difficult to seize in the sea, can move but slowly on the shore. Pencroff, who knew their habits, counseled waiting until the seals were sunning themselves asleep on the sand. Then the party could manage so as to cut off their retreat and dispatch them with a blow on the muzzle. The hunters therefore hid themselves behind the rocks and waited quietly. In about an hour half a dozen seals crawled onto the sand, and Pencroff and Herbert went off round the point of the island so as to cut off their retreat, while the 3 others, hidden by the rocks, crept forward to the place of encounter. Suddenly the tall form of the sailor was seen. He gave a shout, and the engineer and his companions hurriedly threw themselves between the seals and the sea. They succeeded in beating 2 of the animals to death, but the others escaped. "Here are your seals, Mr. Smith," cried the sailor, coming forward. "And now we will make bellows," replied the engineer. "Bellows!" exclaimed the sailor. "These seals are in luck." It was, in effect, a huge pair of bellows, necessary in the reduction of the ore, which the engineer expected to make from the skins of the seals. They were medium-sized, about 6 feet long, and had heads resembling those of dogs. As it was useless to burden themselves with the whole carcass, Neb and Pencroff resolved to skin them on the spot, while Smith and the reporter made the exploration of the island. The sailor and the negro acquitted themselves well, and 3 hours later Smith had at his disposal 2 seal skins, which he intended to use just as they were, without tanning. The colonists, waiting until low water, recrossed the channel and returned to the Chimneys. It was no easy matter to stretch the skins upon the wooden frames and to sew them so as to make them sufficiently airtight. Smith had nothing but the 2 knives to work with, yet he was so ingenious and his companions aided him so intelligently, that, 3 days later, the number of implements of the little colony was increased by a bellows intended to inject air into the midst of the ore during its treatment by heat, a requisite to the success of the operation. It was on the morning of the 20th of April that what the reporter called in his notes the Iron Age began. The engineer had decided to work near the deposits of coal and iron, which were situated at the base of the northeasterly spurs of Mount Franklin, 6 miles from the Chimneys. And as it would not be possible to go back and forth each day, it was decided to camp upon the ground in a temporary hut, so that they could attend to the important work night and day. This settled, they left in the morning, Neb and Pencroff carrying the bellows and a stock of provisions, which latter they would add to on the way. The road led through the thickest part of Jacama Wood, in a northwesterly direction. It was as well to break a path which would henceforth be the most direct route between Prospect Plateau and Mount Franklin. The trees belonging to the species already recognized were magnificent, and Herbert discovered another, the dragon tree, which Pencroff designated as an overgrown onion, which, notwithstanding its height, belongs to the same family of liliaceous plants as the onion, the civet, the shallot, or the asparagus. These dragon trees have ligneous roots which, cooked, are excellent, and which, fermented, yield a very agreeable liquor. They therefore gathered some. It took the entire day to traverse the wood, but the party were thus able to observe its fauna and flora. Top, specially charged to look after the fauna, ran about in the grass and bushes, flushing all kinds of game. Herbert and Spilett shot 2 kangaroos and an animal which was like a hedgehog, in that it rolled itself into a ball and erected its quills, and like an anteater, in that it was provided with claws for digging, a long and thin snout terminating in a beak, and an extensile tongue furnished with little points, which enabled it to hold insects. "And what does it look like boiling in the pot?" asked Pencroff, naturally. "Like an excellent piece of beef," answered Herbert. "We don't want to know any more than that," said the sailor. During the march they saw some wild boars, but they did not attempt to attack the little troop, and it seemed that they were not going to have any encounter with savage beasts, when the reporter saw in a dense thicket, among the lower branches of a tree, an animal which he took to be a bear, and which he began tranquilly to sketch. Fortunately for Spilett, the animal in question did not belong to that redoubtable family of plantigrades. It was an uri, better known as a sloth, which has a body like that of a large dog, a rough and dirty-colored skin, the feet armed with strong claws which enable it to grasp the branches of trees and feed upon the leaves. Having identified the animal without disturbing it, Spilett struck out bear and wrote uri under his drawing, and the route was resumed. At 5 o'clock Smith called a halt. They were past the forest and at the beginning of the massive spurs which buttressed Mount Franklin towards the east. A few hundred paces distant was Red Creek, so drinking water was not wanting. The camp was made. In less than an hour a hut, constructed from the branches of the tropical bindweed, and stocked with loam, was erected under the trees on the edge of the forest. They deferred the geological work until the next day. Supper was prepared, a good fire blazed before the hut, the spit turned, and at 8 o'clock, while one of the party kept the fire going, in case some dangerous beast should prowl around, the others slept soundly. The next morning, Smith, accompanied by Herbert, went to look for the place where they had found the specimen of ore. They found the deposit on the surface, near the sources of the creek, close to the base of one of the northeast buttresses. This mineral, very rich in iron, enclosed in its fusible veinstone, was perfectly suited to the method of reduction which the engineer intended to employ, which was the simplified Catalonian process practiced in Corsica. This method properly required the construction of ovens and crucibles in which the ore and the coal, placed in alternate layers, were transformed and reduced. But Smith proposed to simplify matters by simply making a huge cube of coal and ore, into the center of which the air from the bellows would be introduced. This was, probably, what Tubal-Cain did. And a process which gave such good results to Adam's grandson would doubtless succeed with the colonists of Lincoln Island. The coal was collected with the same facility as the ore, and the latter was broken into little pieces and the impurities picked from it. Then the coal and ore were heaped together in successive layers, just as a charcoal burner arranges his wood. Thus arranged, under the influence of the air from the bellows, the coal would change into carbonic acid, then into oxide of carbon, which would release the oxygen from the oxide of iron. The engineer proceeded in this manner. The sealskin bellows, furnished with a pipe of refractory earth, an earth difficult of fusion, which had previously been prepared at the pottery, was set up close to the heap of ore. And, moved by a mechanism consisting of a frame, fiber cords, and balance weight, it injected into the mass a supply of air, which, by raising the temperature, assisted the chemical transformation which would give the pure metal. The operation was difficult. It took all the patience and ingenuity of the colonists to conduct it properly, but finally it succeeded, and the result was a pig of iron in a spongy state, which must be cut and forged in order to expel the liquefied gangue. It was evident that these self-constituted smiths wanted a hammer, but they were no worse off than the first metallurgist, and they did as he must have done. The first pig, fastened to a wooden handle, served as a hammer with which to forge the second upon an anvil of granite, and they thus obtained a coarse metal, but one which could be utilized. At length, after much trouble and labor, on the 25th of April, many bars of iron had been forged and turned into crowbars, pincers, pickaxes, mattocks, etc., which Pencroff and Neb declared to be real jewels. But in order to be in its most serviceable state, iron must be turned into steel. Now steel, which is a combination of iron and carbon, is made in two ways: first from cast iron, by decarburetting the molten metal, which gives natural or puddled steel, and, second, by the method of cementation, which consists in carburetting malleable iron. As the engineer had iron in a pure state, he chose the latter method, and heated the metal with powdered charcoal in a crucible made from refractory earth. This steel, which was malleable hot and cold, he worked with the hammer. And Neb and Pencroff, skillfully directed, made axe heads, which, heated red hot and quickly plunged in cold water, took an excellent temper. Other instruments, such as planes and hatchets, were rudely fashioned, and bands of steel were made into saws and chisels, and from the iron, mattocks, shovels, pickaxes, hammers, nails, etc., were manufactured. By the 5th of May the first metallurgic period was ended, the smiths returned to the chimneys, and new work would soon authorize their assumption of a new title.